In the Tennessee Supreme Court building in downtown Nashville, part of the old law library has been turned into a museum, the Tennessee Judiciary Museum, managed by Judge Andy Bennett of the Tennessee Court of Appeals. Once you're in the museum, among other famous landmarks of Tennessee law history is an oddity, a glass display full of baseball cards and memorabilia. But it fits right in next to exhibits involving the rights of slaves and the reapportionment of voting districts.
Not only is it an important case in the scope of employment area, but it's the first case in which a professional athlete sued another professional athlete for something that happened on the field. It's a fun case. It has little twists and turns and names of people you'll recognize, and it's just a lot of fun.
The case is Averill versus Luttrell, and it came to be known as the hit heard round the state. I'm Dave Stripling, and this is Tennessee Court Talk. To get the full story about this rather unique case that set a precedent that shocked both the sports world and the legal world, I sat down with Judge Andy Bennett of the modern-day Tennessee Court of Appeals, and via Zoom, Randy Averill, son of Earl Averill Jr., the Nashville catcher that landed the hit heard round the state. Judge Bennett, you've said this is one of your favorite cases in the whole museum.
Absolutely.
What makes it stand out for you?
I love baseball. It's a case that involves baseball and law, two of my favorite things that intersect.
So, Judge Bennett, take us back to that night.
It was a warm evening. It was still about 90 degrees at game time. The attendance wasn't so great that night. It was about 1,200. One of the newspaper columnists said it must have been a good TV night. But it was a good night for baseball, as most nights are.
Long before Nashville had the sounds, the Music City's minor league baseball club for many decades was called the Vols.
The Vols were playing the Chattanooga Lookouts. The Lookouts were affiliated with the Washington Senators, and the Nashville Vols were affiliated with what were then known as the Cincinnati Redlegs. They went with Redlegs in the middle of the 50s to distinguish themselves from the communist Reds.
Earl Averill Jr., the son of Major League Baseball Hall of Famer Earl Averill Sr., had signed with the Cleveland Indians out of the University of Oregon in 1952 and then began his professional baseball career. By 1955, he had advanced to the Double-A team in Nashville.
He was up and coming. He had some pop in his bat. People had their eye on him.
Lyle Luttrell was a standout at Illinois Wesleyan University and signed with the Washington Senators in 1951. After playing baseball for the United States Navy during the Korean conflict and various minor league stops, Luttrell had landed with the 1955 Lookouts.
Luttrell and Averill had no relationship, good or bad. They knew each other were, but that was it. But there was a rivalry.
In a city rivalry that transcended baseball or any sport, Nashville and Chattanooga newspapers played up the Vols Lookout series as us versus them. On July 7th, Earl Averill hit 3 home runs and 2 doubles for 16 total bases, which broke a Southern League record that had stood for a quarter of a century. The Lookouts were ready to get revenge on the visiting Vols.
And to complicate it a little more, Earl Averill, the catcher, his contract was owned by the Cleveland Indians, and he was on loan to the Cincinnati organization. That night, the pitcher was Jerry Lane. Lane had been in the majors in Cincinnati, and he had been sent down. It wasn't known then, but he would never see the majors again. He was known as a guy who wouldn't mind throwing at you a little bit. He was way behind. It was 6-1 in the 5th inning, and he was pitching to shortstop Lyle Luttrell for the Lookouts. And Luttrell was in a hot streak. He was hitting 400 in the month of August and had a 13-game hitting streak. Earlier in the season, he had been hit in the face with a baseball, and his jaw had been broken, but it was mended now. He was back playing, and it seemed to have had no effect on him. He was hitting very well. The first time he had batted against Lane had thrown outside pitches exclusively to him, so Luttrell decided he would step up in the batter's box as the pitch was being thrown. Interestingly, the first pitch was actually a little inside, and when Luttrell stepped up, he had to dodge it. Lane didn't like him stepping up in the batter's box and said so. Something like, "I don't like that, don't do it again or I'll stick it in your ear." That was Luttrell's testimony, and the testimony of the manager said he heard it too. Averill said he didn't hear that, so who knows. The second pitch, he stepped up in as well, and it was inside again, and he had to dodge it. The third pitch was also inside. So here we are, 3 balls and no strikes. And what happens? But Lane throws a pitch and hits Luttrell. Now, it didn't hit him hard. He nicked him somewhere in the thigh area. It wasn't terribly painful, but Luttrell was frustrated about the whole deal. And he tossed the bat into the infield. Earl Averill took offense at that. He thought he was throwing the bat at his pitcher. It probably didn't go anywhere near. Most of the testimony of the witnesses was the bat went to the shortstop third base area. Lane testified that he had to jump to get out of the way, but that didn't go over well. Nobody really believed it. I think he was just trying to help his buddy. But in Earl's mind's eye, as he remembers it, he said that he thought it was going at the pitcher. And he stood up and he let Luttrell have it. And, Luttrell was looking at the pitcher. So Averill's fist hit Luttrell just above and behind the right ear. So it was kind of a sucker punch. He wasn't looking. The testimony was that he went down like a tree felled by an axe. Just fell straight down. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. When he hit the ground, his feet were still in the batter's box. He had no chance to defend himself. And he landed face forward, and so he re-broke his jaw. He had dirt and material in one of his eyes, and he had a concussion.
Earl's wife, Pat, was back at their apartment in Nashville with her 2 young children, terrified by what she heard on the broadcast. Their son, Randy Averill.
She was listening to the game on the radio, and the Nashville announcer kept repeating, "He hasn't moved. He's not getting up. He hasn't moved." And her thought was, oh my God, he's killed a guy. What am I going to do? I've got 2 little kids.
Luttrell didn't wake up until he got to the hospital. They tried ammonia capsules on him at the baseball park, and it didn't work. He was out.
It was forever before there was any report that Luttrell had regained movement on the ground, let alone recovery.
When he woke up, he thought he was in Nashville.
Luttrell, still in Chattanooga, regained consciousness a half hour later with a concussion, 2 missing teeth, and once again, a busted jaw.
And then, as one of the sports writers said, all heck broke loose.
Engel Stadium erupted into bedlam. The dugouts cleared. Fans spilled onto the field.
Fights broke out. The manager of the Lookouts, Cal Irmer, went and jumped on the back of Earl Averill. And the manager of the Nashville Vols, Joe Schultz, jumped on top of Irmer. So there was a pile at home plate. The team trainer and one of the other ball players were trying to protect the unconscious Luttrell laying on the ground there from getting stepped on by players who were pushing and fighting. It was described as a near riot.
One of the biggest things that came out was that the Chattanooga chief of police was in the audience at the ball game and was down on the field saying he's going to jail, like a good politician.
He ordered his policemen out onto the field to restore order.
Dad spent the night in jail.
Nothing became of that, but he was arrested. It must have been quite a crazy scene.
The owner of the Lookouts was Joe Engel, one of the most colorful characters in the history of baseball.
Well, Joe Engel's fascinating. He was known as the Barnum of the Bush Leagues. He would have all kinds of promotions. He once traded a ball player for a turkey. He said the turkey was having a better year. Engel wanted a lawsuit filed right then.
Engel stormed up to the press box, and soon an announcement followed. Is there a lawyer in the house?
And funny enough, there was. Sitting on the third base side of the stadium was future Justice Ray Brock, Supreme Court Justice. But he was just a lawyer then, and he answered the call and met with Joe Engel. He said Engel was the maddest man he had ever met at that moment. So he went back to his office and wrote up a complaint, went to the clerk's house and filed it with the clerk at the clerk's house. You could actually do that back then. If you could find the clerk, you could file something. Then he went back to the hospital where Luttrell had been taken, and Luttrell retroactively okayed everything.
Luttrell filed a civil suit for $50,000 against both Earl Averill and the Nashville Vols. Soon, Averill was called up to finish his season in AAA Indianapolis as the wheels of justice slowly turned.
The civil suit on behalf of Luttrell proceeded to a Chattanooga jury. They found not only Earl Averill liable, it was hard not to. I mean, he had 1,200 witnesses to what he did, but they also sued the Nashville Baseball Club, and it was found liable as well. $5,000 judgment for which both were jointly liable. That means they both had to pay. So if Earl was totally broke, the baseball club could pay it all and then go against Earl for half of it if they wanted to. The baseball club appealed the case. At first, Averill and the ball club were represented by the same lawyer, and then it became apparent that their interests were not quite the same. So he dropped out, and each of them got lawyers. Now, Earl didn't really know how he got the lawyer he got. He thinks the baseball club just went out and hired him a lawyer. They hired him a good one. Jack Chambliss was a fine lawyer in Chattanooga, well-known, well-respected. And Nashville had Jack Norman as their lawyer.
The Nashville Ball Club appealed, but Earl Averill did not. The club was found not liable under the doctrine of respondeat superior, and Earl Averill was left owing the entire judgment.
The argument that Nashville used was that Earl didn't act within the scope of his employment, claiming that hitting people was not part of baseball, and so the employer should not be held liable. And they won with that. It's kind of funny. Nashville's manager, Joe Schultz, who was quite a character himself, the first and only manager of the Seattle Pilots and immortalized in Ball 4. Schultz was quoted by the Nashville paper the next day as saying that Earl didn't do anything wrong. He was just protecting his pitcher, and that was the job. If it was his job, then he wasn't outside the scope of employment. But Joe Schultz never testified at that trial, and the only proof for Earl Averill that was put on was Earl Averill's testimony itself. Of course, he had to admit hitting him. Again, 1,200 witnesses. It's not something you could really deny. So the baseball club was off the hook, and Earl Averill was left holding the bag for the entire $5,000 civil judgment.
And now, sports fans, it's time for the 7th inning stretch. We'll be back in 1 minute after this sidebar from Judge Bennett.
There are a couple of oddities that I thought were interesting, dealt with the appeal. Two of the appellate judges, one of them had spent some time after World War II at Nuremberg as one of the judges at Nuremberg. Another one had been in the Tennessee National Guard, and he rode with Pershing as they were protecting the Mexican border and chasing Pancho Villa. And then he went to Europe for World War I and was shot and left for dead on the battlefield, and the British found him alive and rescued him. So some very interesting stories have nothing to do with baseball, but these two judges really were fascinating people and had already lived fascinating lives when they did this case. What else is interesting, the umpire behind home plate later went to the major league. He called the last out at Ebbets Field, and he was involved in a strange mishap during a ball game, I believe in Chicago, where two balls were actually put into play at the same time. After that season, his contract was not renewed.
Lyle Luttrell made it up to the majors, but as a player, he was never really the same.
The testimony at the trial was that he continued at that point, which was 2 years later, having headaches and things, but he made it to the majors. He played a couple of years with the Washington Senators. He was never a star or anything. He went back and spent a few years in the minors before he quit baseball. In fact, he played in Nashville 1 year.
The Averills struggled to pay the $5,000 judgment over the next several years, as Earl continued his minor league and, quite often, major league career. Years later, Pat Averill recalled feeling rejected and left to fend for themselves. Randy Averill remembers those struggles.
After that, I think she and my dad probably both felt abandoned by the team, by both the Nashville team and by the Cleveland Indians, of which he was property/employee, and they basically said, "Oh, it's not our problem," and they offered virtually no help.
$5,000 doesn't sound like a lot of money to us today, but in 1956 and 7, that's a lot of money. That was as much as they made in a year.
On a minor league salary, it was a mountain to pay. It wasn't possible for them to pay it.
He was soon to have first a cup of coffee and then really get called up. He played 7 years in the majors, bits of 7 years.
He was the type of player that every team wanted, and every team was constantly looking to upgrade the position. So there was always a team who wanted to trade for him, and there was always a team who wanted to get rid of him.
Wherever he went, they sort of followed him and garnished some of his wages.
They couldn't get credit for anything, They couldn't buy a car unless they saved up and paid cash for it. Buying a house was out of the question. Not to mention the fact that they got traded a lot, so buying a house wasn't real wise in the first place.
Finally, in 1961, with Major League expansion came better fortunes for the Averills, as Earl became a member of the new Los Angeles Angels, owned by the singing cowboy Gene Autry.
What eventually happened was when Dad ended up with the Angels, that Gene Autry called in some favors and got people to pay the fine for him.
The Cleveland Indians, who remember owned Earl's contract back in 55, and the California Angels chipped in the last $3,500 and paid the judgment. Earl always felt like he didn't get much of a raise that year because they used the money to pay off his judgment.
Nearly 70 years have passed since what was called the hit heard round the state. It's been cited in several other notable sports cases.
It's the first case in which a professional athlete sued another professional athlete for something that happened on the field. It set that precedent, and there have been lawsuits since then. Major League Baseball, Billy Martin hit Cubs pitcher Jim Brewer, and Brewer sued him. They settled out of court. In '65, Juan Marshall hit John Roseborough with a bat during his at-bat, and Roseborough sued him. That settled out of court as well. Pro football, there was a case involving the Minnesota Vikings' Dale Hackbart. In the NBA, a guy who became more famous as a coach, Rudy Tomjanovich, who was hit in the face with a fist by another basketball player on the court. That's pretty famous in the NBA.
While Averill versus Luttrell became a landmark case in employment and sports law, it also became a taboo topic in the Averill household for the next half-century, as Randy Averill remembers.
Mom, she never wanted to talk about it. There was just, all I know is that if the subject came up, she would tense up and the subject would go away rather quickly. She was still very traumatized. It was, today we'd say it was PTSD. I knew somewhere along the lines as a kid, I knew that Dad had earned a nickname that thankfully was temporary. He was called One Punch for a while. I'd learned generalities about it, but it was very much a taboo subject. Eventually, some 50 years later, in the early 2000s, he had been listening to the Seattle sports talk station, and they were talking about on-field fights. And the radio personalities were in agreement that you couldn't be sued for an on-field fight. Couldn't happen. And so Dad really couldn't resist calling in to correct them on that. He called in and had a nice chat with them and said, not only can it happen, it happened to me. So that was published in the paper. And my daughter came down, she saw the paper and she looked at it and says, "Grampy, how come I never knew you punched a guy out?" And my mom heard her and went, "What?" And my mom, 50 years later, she was just beside herself. She couldn't believe it. She couldn't believe he had called in. She was fearful of what all her friends would think, because certainly they'd read it in the paper.
But, as they say, time heals all wounds. Earl and Pat eventually made peace with the events of 1955. Earl even helped Judge Bennett with the exhibit at the Tennessee Judiciary Museum.
I did track him down. I sent him a letter and asked if I could talk to him, and he emailed me back and made a "Here come the judge" joke, and I could tell then he was going to be a fun guy to talk to. He was very friendly. He was a little sheepish about talking about it at first, but he opened up pretty quickly. I sent him a transcript of the trial. A few days later, I hadn't heard from him, and I emailed him and said, "Did you get it?" And he said, "Yeah, I got it, but I can't get it away from my wife yet, so I haven't read it."
Pat Averill eventually made peace with the events as well and gave a full interview on her husband and the incident to SABR, the Society of American Baseball Research.
She had family around her, had time to process it and put it in perspective, and I think at that time she finally came to realize this is something in the past. It happened, it was terrible, but we can put it in the past now.
Earl Averill was not a bad guy. He had a bad moment, and it followed him the rest of his life. And you have to try and remember that, we saw Earl, and Earl is sort of immortalized in this on what might be his worst day. And he was a good guy, and I think that should be remembered too. He was liked by the fans, liked by his teammates.
Lyle Luttrell left baseball in 1959 and settled in Chattanooga, where he married, had 5 kids, and passed away in 1984 at the age of 54. He's buried in the Chattanooga National Cemetery. Earl led the Angels in home runs in 1961. Then his career bounced around the majors and minors until he retired in 1965. He, Pat, and their 4 children settled in Tacoma, Washington, where among other things they ran an upholstery business together and did a lot of fishing. When Earl passed away in 2015, the Seattle Mariners held a moment of silence in his honor. Both men live on forever in legal history and are enshrined in the Tennessee Judiciary Museum, where you can visit the Hit Heard Round the State exhibit today.
You never know when something's going to happen that matters. Who went to this game thinking they would see a legal precedent or the genesis of a legal precedent? What ball player thought they would possibly ever be involved in something like that? You never know where a legal precedent will come from.
For Tennessee Court Talk, I'm Dave Stripling. For more information about Averill versus Luttrell, visit TennesseeJudiciaryMuseum.org. For more Tennessee Court Talk, visit tncourts.gov. You can also find us on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.